From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. Hello. Are we starting? Okay. I'm Mary Uy with the Preservation Directorate, and we are very happy to have you here for our very special program. This is our 60th Topics in Preservation Series program. And before we begin, we ask you to silence your cell phones and to sign the welcome sheet that is making its way around the room. We use our attendance numbers to help us plan our future events. And if you'd like to receive announcements about our future events, you can leave your email address on that form. We also post all of our events on our website, and the URL is on the screen. You can also subscribe to our Preservation News RSS feed. And now I'd like to introduce our Director of Preservation, Diane van der Reyden.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Mary. Mary Uy has been with us about 1 year now, and she's done a marvelous job as our preservation education specialist. And I also want to thank Angela Burgess for overseeing our webcasting that we're doing today, and Mark Wilson, and all the people that have helped to make this program happen today. It's been a little more complicated than some of our programs, and you'll find out why as I go along. Again, as Mary said, this is our 60th event for the Topics in Preservation series. And that series is sponsored by the Preservation Directorate of the Library of Congress, and I am the director. I'm very privileged to be so. We have, I think, over 24 remote viewers with us today, so I thank all of you that are here in the room with us, and I thank those who are with us virtually. We have representatives joining us virtually from libraries, archives, and universities all over the country, from the University of Texas, that's no surprise, from the University of Maryland, from Michigan, from Syracuse, from Illinois. We also have folks joining us from Notre Dame and Duke and Yale, and from the National Archives and the Georgia Archives and New York Public Library and the Mellon Foundation, just to name a few of the folks that are going to be joining us through this new format of virtual reality. Today's program, as Mary said, is one of a series that we're doing. It's actually the second in a 4-part series, which focuses on commemorating seminal anniversaries of the 4 major graduate conservation training programs in the United States. And these are programs that issue graduate degrees along with a study of preservation. And the degrees may be an MLS or a Master of Arts or a Master of Science, but they do go hand in hand. And the theory behind that was that if the conservator had a graduate degree, it would help in terms of their stature within their institution. It would give them more authority. Well, we know that there are other ways to become a good conservator, and it's not necessarily required that you go through a program. We have many excellent conservators at the library who went through other avenues of training, but we also have a number who've gone through these graduate programs. And so today, many of them who went through the programs that we're going to talk about today, we're going to commemorate 30 years of a very special, really quite unique graduate conservation program that commenced at Columbia University and concluded at the University of Texas in Austin. And we affectionately call that, of course, UTA. Here at the library, we do have a number of graduates from these 2 programs who are now on staff, and some of those folks will be speaking to you today about their experiences, both in their training and how they've applied that training here at the library, after we have a series of esteemed colleagues speaking who have had direct responsibility for guiding these programs. And so this will make a very good integration of sort of where we are, where we've been in terms of this kind of training. Before we get started, I want to make a special announcement in conjunction with introducing the first speaker, who's kind of a surprise speaker with us today. You may or may not be aware that our leader for the last 8 years as Associate Librarian of Library Services, Dr. Deanna Markham, has announced her retirement, and her retirement is effective in December of this year. And she was hoping to be able to join us today to speak to you, and she sends her regrets because unfortunately she had a schedule conflict that came up at the last moment. But she shares her excitement with us in introducing to you today the person who's been selected to be the next Associate Librarian of Library Services, and that is Roberta Schaefer. And Roberta will be beginning her term effective January 2012, but she's been good enough to agree to join us today. Roberta comes to Library Services most recently from her position as law librarian here at the Library of Congress, and before that she was the executive director of the library's Flick FedLink programs, which are a wonderful consortium of federal libraries and services that the library provides for them. And I just found out yesterday that Roberta was actually at the library 35 years ago. It was, I think, her second job that she had, if I remember correctly. And she stayed here for 5 years and left just about the time I came to the library as a recent graduate of the New York training program and intern here at the library. So I didn't get to work with Roberta then, 35 years ago, but I and many of us in the Preservation Directorate have had the pleasure and the privilege of working very closely with Roberta since she returned to the library in 2005. She has a very long and accomplished history of advocacy for preservation of cultural heritage and cultural records. And she's particularly relevant to today's program because at one point in her very full career, Roberta was actually at the University of Texas in Austin as dean of the Graduate School for Library and Information Science, which is the program that oversees the University of Texas's very, very wonderful graduate conservation training program. So at some point in her career, Roberta was in charge of that, and I believe it was August, 1999 to August 2001. So with that, I will now introduce Roberta, and she will say a few words to us. So please join me in welcoming Roberta.
Thank you very much for accepting me as a substitute for my hero, Deanna Markham. But it's not inappropriate, actually, for the law librarian to be with you today because we are incredible beneficiaries of the libraries program and then really of all the programs around the country and the world. We're gathered here and we're joined by many of the individual luminaries as well as institutional supporters, including universities, government entities, and foundations. And we're here, as Diane has said, to mark the 30th anniversary of the creation of a unique program at Columbia University, which merged the study of library science and conservation and preservation. 11 years later, when Columbia's library school closed, and that was in 1992, the program moved lock, stock, and barrel, and I chose that as opposed to hook, line, and sinker, to the University of Texas at Austin, where it thrived, and that is not an exaggeration, for 17 years before closing as a full-fledged academic program in 2009. But later today, I think you will, those of you who are able, will be part of a webinar that this program is sponsoring, which will tell you about the remaining program, which is a very active and interesting presence still at the University of Texas at Austin. Ellen, when we greeted each other this morning, reminded me of something that I had forgotten, and that was that I had hired her at the University of Texas at Austin. But for any of you who know Ellen, and I feel like I know her well, she is such a leader that I think maybe I signed the papers, but she was already hired on to the program for many years before I had the pleasure of actually making it official. Alumni of that program, which, as you know, has had 2 homes, have practiced in libraries and archives all over the world. So its footprint is enormous. We here at the Library of Congress are proud of the fact that many of the graduates have passed through our doors as interns, staff members, visiting scholars and scientists, and leaders within our own institution. And that the library has served not only as an employer of these experts, but our entire staff, enterprise-wise, and of course our entire collections, have been the direct beneficiaries of the knowledge and national and international prominence of this cohort of graduates. So the Library of Congress is really honored today to provide the venue for this commemoration. It's highly appropriate for us. But we also are using this occasion to be part of the conversation about how the Columbia Texas program and others, and let me just drop to a parenthetical here that we took notice of NYU's longevity and contribution last year, and we hope to do the same for Buffalo State and the Winter Delaware program, which will have nice anniversaries in the next 2 years. But we hope that we can find the way for these programs, all of them as a group, to continue to inspire and enable the next generation of practitioners and innovators, and to anticipate the unique challenges that they will face. This means that we have to, all of us in this room, on the phone, and everywhere, find the way to ensure that academic programs have state-of-the-art facilities, that students are exposed to state-of-the-industry best practices, faculties have research resources, administrators can easily see the return on their investment, and, perhaps most important, graduates coming from diverse disciplines and backgrounds can envision an exciting and viable career path before them. Large research institutions like the Library of Congress, but certainly not just us, have a role to play in formal mentoring programs and in institutionally sustaining well-funded, cutting-edge laboratories within our organizations. And this is for research that benefits us, but then, of course, the greater community. As Diane explained, in the next few weeks, the challenges of assuring the library's ability to make critical contributions in conservation and preservation will fall formally and directly within my portfolio. As the law librarian, I've just been able to enjoy the riches that have fallen down from me, but now I've got to sort of stand up and take the bat at the plate. I will be looking to lessons learned from the leading programs of the 20th century to help us define where the library as an entire institution is needed as collaborator, coach, convener, and cheerleader, so that generations to come have bona fide reasons for celebrations and not merely commemorations. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberta, for cheering with us for our wonderful staff here, several of whom will speak today, as you will see, to share with us their memories from Columbia and the University of Texas at Austin. We proudly introduce Karen Modilewski, Claire Deacle, Jim Thurn, Benjamin Ballman, and ending with our first speaker, Ellen Cunningham-Krupa. Karen Modilewski, who joins us today from the Institute of Museum and Library Services over on M Street Northwest, was the Director of Preservation and Conservation Studies at the University of Texas at Austin from 1995 to 1999. Her work prior to this includes Director of the Northeast Document Conservation Center's Field Service Program, Adjunct Lecturer on Preservation for Simmons Graduate School of Library and Information Science, Faculty Member of the Commission on Preservation and Access's 8-day program for preservation administrators in college libraries. Claire Deacle is a preservation specialist at the Library of Congress and works in the Conservation Division as a senior book conservator. She graduated from the Conservation Studies program of the School of Library Service at Columbia University in 1992. Jim Thurn is a native of Syracuse, New York. He completed the conservation track at the Kilgartland Center for Preservation of the Cultural Record at the University of Texas at Austin, and his internship in book conservation at the Library of Congress. Since 2006, he has been a preservation specialist at the library in the Preventive Conservation, now Collection Stabilization section. Ben Ballman is a preservation specialist in the collections stabilization section of the Conservation Division at the library, and is also currently serving as the acting head of the collections care section. He completed his graduate degree in preservation administration of library and archival materials at the University of Texas at Austin in 2006 and has since worked at the library. And to our first speaker, Ellen Cunningham Krupa is an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Art Conservation at the University of Delaware and adjunct faculty in the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at Simmons College. She received a Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Texas at Austin and holds an endorsement of specialization in administration of preservation programs for libraries and archives from Columbia University's School of Library Service. She was the founding director of the William and Margaret Kilgarland Center for Preservation of the Cultural Record at the University of Texas at Austin School of Information, where she also taught from 2000 until 2009. And now, please welcome Ellen.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Mary, and many thanks to the Library of Congress for this wonderful idea to celebrate the histories of the U.S.-based conservation programs. It's indeed a huge honor for me and a real pleasure to be here and to see so many colleagues. I feel like this is the best party I've been to in a number of years. And I wanted to say also a warm hello to those of us who are joining us via webcast today. Many of us in the field of library and archives preservation and conservation remember Paul Banks for establishing and bringing professional and graduate academic status to our field of practice and research. Paul, for those of you who may not be as old as I am, Paul was the founding director of the Columbia University School of Library Service Conservation Education Programs. Back in 1981 is when they commenced. So thanks to today's program, I thought we had a really perfect moment to acknowledge Paul's longtime vision and to just make a small nod to Paul and thank him for all that he has done to really take our field to a whole new status in the United States. So my small contribution to this celebration is to take us back in time a bit to when Paul was a young man living in New York City in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. I'm presently a doctoral student in American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and my scholarship has afforded me the wonderful time to actually do some research on Paul a couple of years ago, which I recently presented at the American Popular Culture and American Cultural Heritage Association meetings. So what I'm going to do today is give you just a real brief taste of what I've learned about Paul's early years as he began to find his way in the world personally and to discover what kind of work fulfilled and captivated him intellectually. And I want to apologize both to you and to Paul for abbreviating his youth quite a bit to fit today's schedule. And I wanted really, though, to say up front the main highlight of my presentation is that Paul was very concerned about the lack of formal education opportunities as early as 1960, and he actually began to publish in 1960 about his concerns for the lack of training in our field. So please don't flinch as well when I use the term restoration in my talk. I'm just attempting to try to remain true to the terminology that Paul used at the time and what I've encountered in the little bit of literature that I've looked at in the late 1950s and early 60s. Okay, so let's commence. History will never fully decipher the interplay of personal motivations that fueled Paul's tireless, passionate commitment to library and archives conservation. He left behind a somewhat sketchy record for the late 1950s to mid-1960s. However, the one we pieced together suggests that predominant people, excuse me, I looked at the PowerPoint and thought, am I on here? That predominant people and associated events in his personal and professional biography intermingled to help him develop a unique intellectual understanding and articulation of conservation. Paul moved to New York City in May of 1956 at the ripe age of 22. Having completed 3 years of study in printing management, his interest in fine printing and bookmaking could likely be furthered by the relative wealth of hand printers and binders residing in the city. He landed penniless and searching for work, but soon found a job at George McKibben & Son, which was a book manufacturing firm and factory on the waterfront in Brooklyn. He had relocated from Pittsburgh, where he spent 3 years studying at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, which of course is now Carnegie Mellon University, in the School of Printing Management. Throughout his teens and early 20s, it seemed that he was destined to be a printer, though the alliance of printing and hand bookbinding began for him at a very early age. As a young boy, the linotypes and large printing presses in the small town newspaper office where his aunt worked as a reporter had fascinated Paul. And it was in his early teens when he first dabbled in bookbinding. Having come across an article on how to bind a book, he improvised some equipment and bound a few issues of some personal magazines. He later recalled with vivid memory, and I think a few people in the room might have a similar feeling about some of the early bindings they produced, that, quote, "it was ghastly, but it's mercifully long since disappeared." While he found the work at McKibben & Son instructive, the mechanized factory setting didn't appeal to him. Stemming from strong impulses to be able to do things himself and to carry them all the way through, characteristics that truly would define him for the rest of his life, Paul had become increasingly taken with the hands-on aspects of printing and binding in his later high school years and throughout his education at Carnegie Tech. Concurrent with his interest in this hands-on production was a sensitivity to the aesthetics aspects of printing and bookmaking. During his high school years, Ralph Bishop, who was a print shop teacher in the laboratory school of the Colorado State College of Education in Greeley, introduced Paul to fine press books. Bishop exemplified a dedication to printing and to quality that resonated deeply with his sensibilities, and Paul later credited Bishop with being an extremely important influence in his life. Paul continued to look for other jobs in New York City with an eye on the publishing industry. Within a few months, he accepted a job at the Viking Press as a book designer and production assistant, where until 1959, he designed and saw into production some 30 to 40 books. There he found a supportive department head who recognized Paul's potential and looked after the 25-year-old who later described himself during this work period as, quote, "not always the easiest or most obedient or docile employee possible," unquote. Though Paul was very proud of his work at Viking, the design process, which involved specifying design on paper rather than creating the actual product, removed him from the physical making of the printed book, which frustrated him. And this is a picture of Paul at the left here in 1960. It was a picture that went along with an early publication he created. And then we see Paul much later at the University of Texas standing next to his beloved hygrothermograph. And this is a picture of one of the books that he designed for Viking Press, which is lovely. Came out in 1959, one of the last years he was working for them. In his first professional writing called A Controversial View of the Extra Binder in America, which was published in 1960 in a trade publication called Book Production, Paul reveals a 26-year-old who is in equal measures analytical, opinionated, and plucky. In an attempt to clarify the work being done in America by binders clumped into the category which was called extra binder, he defined 4 basic subcategories. Can you imagine being 26 and writing in a professional publication, say, this is how I'm going to define an extra binder? He defined them 4 ways. Okay, commercial, institutional, semi-professional, and creative professional. Paul was aware of the polemic nature of his thinking. Obviously, where he was publishing he was making a statement. He minced no words in disdaining the kind of, quote, lack of originality among commercial binders. Excuse us, commercial binders, you're all so fabulous now. We can't thank you enough. This binder, he suggested, quote, generally does a wide variety of work, including binding magazines in buckram, preparing family Bibles, and a certain amount of half or full leather bindings, which are often poorly constructed, and if decorated, this is done in either 19th century taste or with no taste at all. They are usually characterized by lettering done with dreadful types, and if extra special, a great deal of gold put on with no discernible rhyme or reason, unquote. At the time, he elevated what he called the creative professionals, quote, the people who are wholly professional and that they derive their livelihood from binding and who try to make each book that they work on a unique example of craftsmanship and design, unquote. He went on to name 5 of the handful of such binders in America, including one of his former teachers at Columbia, Gerhard Gerlach, and Harold Triboulet, who was manager of the Department of Graphic Conservation at R.R. Donnelly & Sons in Chicago, whom he greatly admired. Unbeknownst to Paul at the time, he would work extensively throughout many, many years with Triboulet. And this is a lovely binding that was done by Harold Triboulet in 1949. Paul's motivations for publishing his article in 1960 revolved primarily around his concern with the generally unsound methods and materials used by many commercial binders. He articulated for the first time in his lifelong journey in library and archives conservation the topics that came to define him. First, his regard for the binders who work in or for libraries, quote, who are burdened with administrative work, unquote. I think we can all relate to that. And, quote, who struggle valiantly to keep our great libraries from falling apart, unquote. Secondly, he was very sorry that there was a lack of formal training for binders, whom he called craftsmen at the time in the United States. On the latter topic, he lamented, "We have nothing that even approaches a professional training course in extra binding, as there is in most of the European universities. Two universities, Columbia and UCLA, offer courses in binding, and while in both cases the course can be repeated for no credit, they are basically 4 or 5 hour per week courses, which last 1 academic year. Moreover, most of the good binders who are at work now find it difficult to make time for teaching and for training apprentices." When Paul penned this article, he was devouring multiple classes in bookbinding and calligraphy at night at Columbia University and engaged actively in the National Guild of Bookworkers, which was based in New York City, still is. With what we know about Paul's interests and development by 1960, it makes sense that he would be concerned in general with the quality of binding, and more particularly with the problem of the survival of the hand-bound book, given the mechanization of the publishing and commercial binding industries. However, we have to ask, why at this early moment in Paul's education as a binder would he have been concerned with the lack of training programs in America? I think there are a number of answers to this question, but I believe in large part the answer lies in his personal educational experiences, particularly in the effort he exerted to find good bookbinding instructors. While matriculating at Carnegie Tech, Paul searched out bookbinding lessons in Pittsburgh. Reese C. David, whom Paul described as an old-line binder who followed in the tradition of producing deluxe bindings, taught Paul in his bindery, located in the bedroom and garage of David's home. And I have to say, in his oral history, it's very charming. Paul comments that this binder's particular specialty was inlaying mandolin clips into the covers of his binding. So, and you can imagine, Paul, how he delivered that, that notion of inlaying mandolin clips. So Paul took evening courses in Columbia University's graphic arts program when he got to New York for 4 years, where he studied bookbinding with Gerhard Gerlach and Laura Young. And this is one of Gerhard's early bindings from 1939. He was really a really elegant binder. By 1959, Paul had left Viking. Still interested in fine printing, he went to work as a typographer and production assistant for Clark & Way, which was a small fine printing establishment, a position he held for 9 months. And by late 1960, Paul, who was living in a small flat in the East Village, then called the Lower East Side, established a bookbindery in his bedroom, where he did a modicum of private design and binding work. Soon after, he opened a storefront on East 9th with a young woman who was a printer. And with help from his colleagues, he established a workable bindery where he took on freelance work as a designer, binder, and restorer, which he continued until he left in the summer of 1964 to go be the conservator at the Newberry Library. And this is a wonderful little pencil drawing of Paul in his bindery. Roberta Paulette at Yale shared this with me. It's in her office, and she took a nice image for me to share with you. Throughout Paul's years in New York City, the Guild of Bookworkers played a prominent role in his life. And this is, I wanted to include the Guild's logo from 1906 to 1959 here to show you. The Guild served as the primary membership organization for people in the book trades throughout the 20th century. Paul, who described himself in the 1962 Guild membership list as a bookbinder, calligrapher, designer, specialist in restoration and repair, and professional versus amateur teacher, was a particularly active member, serving on the publicity and library committees, the latter which he co-chaired in the early 1960s. In addition to participating in Guild meetings, Paul attended lectures and tours sponsored by the Guild, becoming closely associated with and counted among the people who in the 60s and 70s led what James Reed Cunningham calls, quote, a renaissance in bookbinding in the United States, unquote. It's difficult to exaggerate the importance of the relationships Paul forged and the richness of the learning opportunities he created as he participated in the Guild. It was through the Guild that he learned of Harold Triboulet's work and was exposed to lectures by handbinders and restorers such as Roger Powell, a renowned English binder who restored the Book of Kells for Trinity College Dublin in the early to mid-1950s. By 1962, Paul, an earnest, eager learner and an active teacher and collaborator, had become increasingly central to the dynamics of New York's vibrant growing book arts community. It was through his membership in the Guild that he came to know Carolyn Horton, who would become unquestionably the biggest influence in his young life. And she was an active member in the Guild through the 1960s, and she had moved to New York from Chicago in 1958. And she established a bindery and restoration studio in her family's brownstone in Chelsea. And I wanted to show you an image. This is one of the bindings that Paul created for one of the Guild of Bookworkers shows, and this was in 1963, and he chose The Black's a Clown Show by Paul Genet to bind. And if you look to on your far right, that is Harold Triboulet, and next to him is a very young Carolyn Horton, and Marilyn and Ross Widener on the left. Over the 27 years of Horton's business, she restored book collections for institutions large and small, prestigious and less known, in New York, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. She and her staff cleaned and refurbished private collections on site, as well as those of art dealers and private rare book collectors who sought her services. Paul knew of Horton's work and her reputation as an ingenious book restorer, and came to know her through the Guild, where for many years she presided as chair of the supply committee, writing committee reports for the Guild's journal discussing the technical and scientific aspects of materials used in bookbinding and restoration. Paul became increasingly interested in book restoration versus book binding. He liked the challenge of adapting to the existing object and the unpredictability of restoring a book as opposed to creating something new. Having learned a tremendous amount from Laura Young, Paul left her tutelage and began working part-time for Horton. Horton's clientele was diverse, and in her workshop, Paul performed a wide range of restoration and binding work. He admired and respected Horton for her skills and knowledge, and for her ingenious problem-solving and can-do attitude. During the years he worked with Horton, Paul would flourish. In this formative period under her tutelage, one project in particular would take his thinking about collections and conservation to a new and visionary level. And in 1961, Horton and her staff undertook an unprecedented project in the U.S. libraries at that time, the cleaning and repair of the 37,000-volume collection of the Grolier Club. Horton hired Paul part-time on the project, and for many months he worked alongside a large handful of full-time and part-time workers, and Horton herself, who was on site part-time throughout the project. Paul reveled in this opportunity to examine a vast range of bindings, later commenting that the Grolier provided a wonderful exposure that he had never experienced. Given the large number and rare nature of the collections and the particular fragility of the vast collection of catalogs in the library, many of which were bound pamphlet style, Horton and her colleagues devised new methods for addressing conservation problems at the collection level. Many of these methods that she and her staff would create were detailed in 1967 in her publication, Cleaning and Preserving Bindings and Related Materials. But most critically for Paul, in terms of his emerging professional focus, he became absorbed by the problems of conserving large collections as a whole, issues that consumed his work, his research, and his teaching, in which he would champion passionately for the rest of his life. And briefly, I wanted to it takes a huge village to do research, I'm finding. And I wanted to thank a number of people who I have consulted and who have given me access to archives over the past couple of years to do this research. And finally, I want to thank you so much for your very kind attention. I know it's hard to follow when someone's reading a talk sometimes, and I appreciate your patience. And I wanted to take this opportunity to, one, express how very proud I am of all of the students here in the audience and out in the world who graduated from the Columbia programs, where I came from too, And from the UT programs, when I was teaching there from 2000 to 2009, that was the most extraordinary and wonderful experience I've had in my life, and I am very humbled indeed to see you all out there doing amazing, amazing things, and to have just some little part in helping you accomplish what you want to accomplish is a lifelong treasure for me. I also wanted to express my thanks to the Mellon Foundation for their very generous support of library and archives conservation, and my personal and very heartfelt thanks to the conservation education programs at Buffalo State University, New York University, and the University of Delaware. The latter program, who is working in partnership with Simmons University and the Library of Congress. Thank you, Library of Congress. These three programs bring truly extraordinary expertise to the education of library and archives conservators, and I think you will join me in saying that I believe our future in our field is in exceptionally capable and very committed hands. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Karen Modleski. I'm going to take a very different approach from Ellen. I'm not a historian. I'm simply somebody who has great pride in the program, a belief in its key importance to the preservation of our culture and our information resources, and a deep hope that it can reinvent itself yet again to meet the needs of collections holding institutions throughout the world. As you know, or may not know, Roberta Schaefer was arriving at Texas just about the point in time in which I was leaving, and so I didn't know her there, although I had known her at the law library. We are thrilled to have you here and taking Deanna's place, and thrilled to have someone who is so knowledgeable about preservation, especially in the context of very large, broad, immensely important collections, because that is where Paul went. Paul went from his experience as a binder and as a restorer to considering what the context of that work might be. And the context is always, for Paul, in the library or in the archives or in the museum in its information areas rather than its artistic areas in particular. And so he formed at New York University a program to train people in the management of conservation and preservation inside of these very large collections, which is very different from the treatment of individual objects as artworks. And all of you who have trained as conservators know that there is a constant sort of tension, we call it a dynamic tension, between treating a thing as an artwork and treating a thing as an object which carries information, which is important as a part of our cultural resources and the development of our ability to understand where we come from, where we are, and where we're going. When Columbia University closed its graduate library program in 1992, it put a treasure at risk. The program, initiated by Paul in 1981 and headed by Carolyn Harris from 1990 to 1992, was at risk of loss. Now, Carolyn had worked at the University of Texas, and she was able to persuade the then dean, Brooke Sheldon, to take on the program. I'm not sure I can use your phrase, Roberta. What did you call it? Barrel? Lock, stock, and barrel. Because in fact, it didn't bring everything with it. It really was kind of hook, line, and sinker in some ways. And what I have to say, as having been privileged to follow Carolyn when she died of cancer in 1994, as director of the program, is that it was one heck of a learning experience. And I have a lot to say about the program, in which I have immense faith and for which I have great affection, not only for the program, but for all of its graduates, and great pride. That it faced problems that we continue to face today as conservators and preservation professionals. And I'm going to identify some of them for you. Roberta is shaking her head because she knows exactly what they are. Ellen, I know, knows exactly what they are. Many of you as students and graduates and as employers of those people know exactly what they are. First, while the program brought very fine conservation teachers in the form of Gary Frost, who is now Emeritus University Conservator at the University of Iowa, and it had incredibly strong preservation and conservation faculty in Carolyn Harris and in Paul Banks. It needed laboratories. It needed collections on which to allow students to work. Do you know how hard it is to talk people into letting students work on precious objects? Okay. It needed new conservators, additional instructors. Karen Pavelka came as paper conservator. Roberta Paulette, who is, Karen remains at the University of Texas in its new frame of reference as integrating conservation and preservation into the lives of all students of its programs. Roberta Paulette, who is now the director of conservation at the Yale University Libraries. What we didn't know was that Carolyn was fighting cancer, and when we lost her to the disease in 1994, it left the program in Paul's hands again. Poor Paul, who by that time, I'm quite sure, was extremely tired of the management responsibilities that go along with such a program. I sometimes believe that I came to be director of the program simply because no one else would take it on and I didn't know any better. I'm not a conservator. I am trained as an apprentice in objects conservation, went on to the Northeast Document Conservation Center as a consultant and educator in the care of large-scale collections, risk management, risk identification, the choice of conservators, the decision-making process of treating books as precious objects versus objects that serve a need for a specific length of time, and then find the end of what we would call in archives their retention schedule or interest. One of the challenges was that students had to move from Columbia in New York City to Austin, Texas, to complete their graduate work. There's a challenge for everybody involved, okay? Because Austin is very different from New York. I won't say in what ways, in many good ways as well as bad ways, okay? It is not different in bad ways at all. Austin is an extraordinary city. It has some of the best music, some of the best food, and some of the nicest people you will ever meet in your life. It is, however, not New York. The program differs from its colleagues in the prestigious art conservation training world in not requiring students to have a substantial background in chemistry before they are admitted. And what that meant was that chemistry background, which is essential for making good conservation decisions, needed to be provided within the context of the program itself, which added a layer of work onto all of the other work that we expected those students to do. The students, unlike their colleagues in the normative library programs, which ran from 1 to 2 years, committed themselves to about 3 years of study, which concluded with an externship in which they actually practiced in a large-scale academic research university or other environment, using the skills that we had worked very hard, all of us together, to develop while they were at the program. They began to learn the difference between studying about it and really doing it. Ellen once confided in me that when she was hired at the University of Texas Library, her boss said to her, "Okay, now you graduated from library school, and you have a lot of knowledge, but you don't know anything. And I'm going to teach you how to be a preservation librarian." Does it get it pretty close? Pretty close. And yeah, and Ellen became one of the really finest preservation librarians I have ever met. So her boss did a good job, and Ellen did a good job. Okay. The program also differs from other programs in awarding essentially 2 degrees. One in preservation or conservation. Preservation is a specialty. The conservator students actually receive a special, not degree, but certificate in conservation, and receive a Master's of Library and Information Services or Studies, whatever you happen to call it at your university. None of the other training programs require students to get a degree in museum studies. And so for this program, what you bring together is a body of knowledge, not only of the individual items in the collection, the context in a collection as a whole, but the institution and its social and cultural norms, what it means to be a librarian and to work in a library. And so I believe that it does the best job of training conservators and preservation people to work in those environments of any of the programs, but I'm prejudiced. We had an extraordinary body of students, and we were extremely rigorous in our selection of those students. So if you graduated from the University of Texas, you know you are good, because we wouldn't have taken you as a student if we didn't know you would be good. The program was also, in an odd way, divided from the library school. It was located in the, the remote book repository, which was only a couple of blocks from the library school. But in terms of sort of emotional, intellectual distance, it might as well have been across the country, because you could not get a faculty member to come and visit the training program at the book repository. And finally, because I think conservation and preservation management have a master's as their terminal degree, there was a very big gap between the credibility of trainers, of teachers in the program, all of whom were called lecturers rather than professors or associate professors or adjunct professors. We're called lecturers because we do not have that PhD, which all of our other colleagues at the library school had. And unfortunately, all of this, I think, leads to a very powerful lesson about the need to communicate about what conservation and preservation do. And when I was at the school, we were entering this extraordinary shift in library resources from the physical object, we know that this is difficult to talk about because we know that digital objects are also physical objects, but from the original historical object, the artifact, if you will, to the digital, to the virtual object and its content. And one of the things I believe that the field as a whole has not yet come to terms with is the relationship between those original objects and their complementarity to the digital resources that none of us would do without for a moment if we have a computer and access to a computer. They both have roles. They complement each other. One does not replace the other. And so this program, in being the only conservation program that actually looks at intellectual, informational resources in a context that subsumes all of those potential resources and recognizes that it isn't only the content of the thing that is important, but the historical nature of the thing, the chemical nature of the thing, the aging of the thing. All of those carry important information that it would be tragic for us to lose. And so this particular program has not lost its value and will not lose its value. I think it is extraordinary that the university, however disappointed we are that the program as a whole cohesive program no longer exists there. It is extraordinary that the University of Texas recognizes the importance of communicating across all of the specialties that librarians walk into, the importance of the nature of their collections and their preservation. That is a very powerful and important lesson. Perhaps the most important shift in the curriculum between 1995 and 1999, when I was there, was an increasing emphasis on the importance of leadership and management in preservation and conservation. And as a result of that, students took some very odd courses for conservators. They took courses in the business school, they took courses in the School of Sociology, they took courses in other places that you would not perhaps expect them to, and learned to bring to their practice those other viewpoints and the nature of the need for their resources in those other applications. And I think that that is an enormously important shift in the knowledge of what libraries and archives and information carrying materials in museums do. We produced in those years an extraordinary group of graduates. They are people who, almost to a person, have taken leadership positions in the American Library Association Preservation Concentration Section, in the Society of American Archivists, in the American Institute for Conservation. We trained wonderful, wonderful people. Now I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge, something to chew on at the end of this talk. And it is that in 2001, the Council on Library and Information Resources published an important wake-up call, okay? And it was called Folk Heritage Collections in Crisis. 9 years later, in 2010, it published The State of Recorded Sound Preservation in the United States, a National Legacy at Risk in the Digital Age. The recommendations that follow at the end of each of those publications are almost identical. We still have work to do, and I am immensely proud of the Mellon Foundation's funding and recognition, wisdom in seeing that that work needs to be carried on, its wisdom in seeing that Ellen can contribute to that work, its contributions to Buffalo, to NYU, to Delaware, to the partnership among Delaware, the Library of Congress, and Simmons University, and Michelle Clunan, who is a brilliant dean. I think that what you learn is that to be a director, you have to have some very, very special talents, which are very different from the ones you use as a conservator. You have to be a relationship builder, you have to be a fundraiser, and you have to be a word, I always want to say conquistador, and that's not the right word, although sometimes it feels like the right word. A street fighter, sometimes a street fighter. You need to be a communicator, but you also need to be a passionate sharer of the information that you hold. Because it is through that sharing that you bring support and knowledge of the importance of the field to others outside the field. And so I leave you with that thought, that it is tremendously important to develop your communication skills, skills which nearly everyone in this room has in very high degree and does not always use in the high degree that they might. I think that one of the most extraordinary evolutions and developments of the shift in placement and location of the Texas program is that Ellen will bring with her, as well as other faculty such as Sheila Metzger and others, the notion that it is not just objects here, it is objects in context, and that the context changes from place to place to place and from time to time to time. And right now, the challenge is that the context and time are digital. And we really need to come to terms with that. And we really need to figure out how we're going to make all of these things fit together and work together for everyone's well-being. And with that, I leave you to figure out how to do it, because I don't have an answer for you. And my guess is that until we continue to talk about it as a group and to share among all of these different stakeholders who take part in that group, we will not have an answer. So that's the next step.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen. This concludes the first session, and you can see how wonderful and provocative these talks have been about the theory and philosophy behind this training. Now we're going to shift to the people who are actually doing the work, and we are very, very pleased and proud to have graduates from the program. We're going to
Attending the Kilgarlin Center was a really positive experience, and so I'm happy to be able to share with you some of what I remember about it. My presentation is arranged in 3 portions. First, I'll talk a little about the 2 years that I spent in Austin, Texas as a student doing lab work and coursework. Secondly, I'll talk about the internship which I completed here at the Library of Congress, and which was a requirement of graduation from the Kilgarlin Center. And lastly, I'll talk about some of the work that I've done since that time as a full-time employee here at the library, which the Kilgarlin Center prepared me for. This is an image of the Kilgarlin Center. The Kilgarlin Center was a part of the School of Information at the University of Texas at Austin. Graduates of the Kilgarlin Center received a Master of Science degree in Information Studies, which was accredited by the American Library Association. Students who chose the conservation track also received a Certificate of Advanced Study in Conservation. This slide provides an overview of the primary coursework that conservation students would take. They would take 22 courses for a total of 60 credit hours. The first line on this slide represents 5 semester-long laboratory courses, 3 for book conservation and 2 for paper conservation, with the option of taking a 6th laboratory course as an elective. And the last line on this slide represents several required library and information studies courses. I think the strength of the Kilgarlin Center was the instructors, beginning with the director, Ellen Cunningham Krupa, who set the overall tone of the program and made for a really professional, friendly, and supportive atmosphere. In addition to serving as director, she also taught the preservation management courses, including how to conduct random sampling condition surveys. Karen Pavelka taught the paper conservation courses and collections care courses. Chayla Metzger taught book conservation and history of printing courses. In our book conservation courses, students learned a variety of binding styles and sewing structures, such as the standard case binding shown here, the Ethiopian binding, which is a very early form of binding. We learned how to tie end bands. And we created the quarter style binding with handmade paste paper, and the half style binding with marbled paper and raised sewing supports along the spine, and the full leather style binding, again with raised sewing supports along the spine. It was important that students learn a variety of binding styles and sewing structures because as conservators, these are the types of structures that they'll encounter frequently, and they need to be able to put these back together if they take apart a book as part of a treatment. After we created these book models, we began doing treatments which progressed in level of difficulty. In this image, I'm beginning a leather reback, which included washing the title page and end pages, which were quite yellowed. And the wonderful Chayla Metzger was always available to consult with regarding treatments. This is the finished treatment showing the new leather on the spine, along with blind tooled lines along the sewing supports. Students got really good experience talking with archivists and curators. This is a meeting that Karen Pavelka set up in the Paper Conservation Laboratory. The woman in the gray sweater is an archivist with the Center for American History at the University of Texas. And one day she came to class along with documents from her collection, which the students would soon be treating. So this was a really good experience because as students graduate and become conservators, they often find themselves consulting with archivists, curators, or in the case of the Library of Congress, division chiefs before treating their books and documents. In our paper conservation courses, we also learned a variety of treatment techniques. In this image, a student is removing a silk backing from a manuscript under the watchful and friendly eye of Karen Pavelka, who is also always available to consult with regarding these treatments. We did both individual treatments and group treatments. This is a group treatment doing mending and filling on a large paper document. We learned how to wash documents. And we learned how to line documents to add strength to fragile papers. During their second year, students were encouraged to conduct research projects. A classmate of mine, Rick Taylor, and I did research to develop methods for removing mold from cellulose acetate audio tape. This is one of the audio tapes that we worked with showing mold growth. And these are scanning electron micrographs of the audio tape. In the upper left, we see the edge of the audio tape along with the binder side. The binder is what holds the electromagnetic particles onto the audio tape. In the upper right, we see the edge of the audio tape along with the cellulose acetate backing side. The backing is what provides strength to the audio tape. And in the lower left, we see a top-down view of the binder side along with mold. The mold seemed to prefer growing on the binder side as opposed to the backing side. And in the lower right, we see a close-up of some mold spores. So my classmate Rick Taylor developed a mechanical method for removing mold, and I developed a solvent-facilitated method, which is what's shown here. In this apparatus, the audio tape comes off of the supply reel, across a cleaning platform, around a third wheel before being rewound onto the take-up reel. And on the cleaning platform, I used a mixture of water and isopropyl alcohol to help remove mold and hopefully kill any mold that remained on the audio tape. So I like to call this the solvent-facilitated tape cleaning method. although as I seem to recall, it became known in some circles as the car wash for audio tapes. We did all of this audio tape cleaning outside of the Kilgarlin Center so we wouldn't spread mold spores throughout the building. So here I am late one night on the loading dock cleaning an audio tape. All of the instructors and students worked hard and put in a lot of long hours, but every year they participated in the National Edible Book Festival. So these are edible books that were created when I was there. People get very creative with their edible books, and they use a variety of binding styles and sewing structures. And they get quite detailed and elaborate and quite appetizing. This one on the top is called the Bread Sea Scroll. And this is the edible book that I created when I was there. This book features Hershey's chocolate for the front and back covers. The covers are laced on with licorice. The spine of the text block is composed of roasted marshmallow, and the text block consists of leaves of graham cracker. So this is the s'more variety of edible book. Following my 2 years in Austin, I completed my internship here at the Library of Congress. I was based in the book lab, so I focused on book treatments, but I also did some paper treatments and made some protective housings. I chose one treatment to talk about today. This is a book treatment that I worked on with Tamara Ohanian. This is a book of hymns from the Armenian Church, and the book came to me with the front and back covers taped on with duct tape. The front cover had been removed from another book and cut down to size so that it would fit this book. The first step of the treatment was to remove the duct tape and remove the covers. I created a new front cover by cutting a piece of oak and shaping it using a sanding block. I attached new sewing supports alongside the old supports because the old ones had broken along the joints, which is why it had been taped on. I applied a paper spine lining in between the sewing supports and tied end bands at the head and tail of the text block. I created a handmade heavyweight Western paper cover for the spine of the text block. This cover was not directly attached to the text block, but became directly attached to the leather that went on over this. By doing this, we were able to retain the surface topography of the spine, showing the raised sewing supports, while at the same time allowing that overlying leather to move more independently of the text block. This was important because we wanted to reuse the original leather material, which was fragile and brittle. And so by using this structure, which is called the baggy back structure, we were able to accommodate that more fragile leather and retain it. On the right, there's an image of the new board attached to the text block using the new sewing supports. I covered the new board with leather, which wrapped around the spine of the text block and got tucked in underneath the old leather on the back of the book. And these are after treatment images. On the left, you see the original spine leather, which got adhered to the new leather underneath. And on the right, we see the new leather on the front cover of the book. Following my internship, I became employed full-time here at the Library of Congress as a preservation specialist, where I and my colleagues have conducted condition surveys, preservation assessments, housings, and treatments. And I've been fortunate to work with a group of dedicated and friendly colleagues. We've worked on quite a few projects together. This is the particular group that I've worked with most frequently over the years. My colleagues and I have conducted 2 large-scale statistical random sampling condition surveys for the Law Library, and 1 large-scale condition survey for the Geography and Maps Division. We're currently in the process of housing several thousand rare books from the Rare Book Division. These are housed in boxes of various size, and the boxes are outfitted with foam, which is attached to the boxes using hot melt glue. And we've also housed 320 globes, also for off-site storage in custom boxes. And we again used foam inside these boxes to help protect the globes. We're currently in the process of making more elaborate housings for some rare globes. These boxes are custom made out of binder's board, covered with fabric, and feature front panels of plexiglass so people can see the globes without having to directly handle them. This box was made recently for the Washington Haggadah. This Haggadah is dated 1478. And the box consists of a clamshell box with a self-contained cradle. The cradle helps support the book at an appropriate viewing angle, because if this book were to open and lie flat, it could damage the binding. Based on one of the condition surveys that we did for the Law Library, my colleagues and I are now treating the books from that collection, because the condition survey revealed about 25% of the collection has covers that are either detached or partially detached. And so on the left we see some before treatment images, and on the right after treatment images. These are all the same book. With this project, we're making frequent use of a board slotting machine, which allows us to cut a very thin slot into the spine edge of the cover boards. And that allows us to insert a cotton flange, the other side of which gets attached to the spine of the text block, allowing us to reattach the covers to the books. And we're also replacing the brittle end sheets. So I have good memories of the Kilgarlin Center. I think the center provided a really good foundation both for the internship and subsequent employment. And so I would like to thank all of the instructors from the former Kilgarlin Center, as well as my supervisor, Nancy Love Alexander, and all of my colleagues here at the Library of Congress. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ben Ballman. I think Jim did a fine job of explaining the program as we knew it. So I think there's going to be a little bit of overlap. I apologize for that, and anything I might have missed, I think he covered very nicely. My presentation is a little different. Maybe it's a little more personal, so I apologize for that if how that is. Also, that's my son, so I apologize for the noise. I don't think the love of libraries, I think starts at a very early age. So anyway. So I was asked to present my experiences on the preservation administration side of the UT program. So let me just begin telling you a little about myself and how I arrived at the program, and then ultimately arrived here at this fine institution. I always had an interest in art and history. That led me to pursuing a degree in humanities from Brigham Young University. I knew that the humanities degree would be a very broad degree that would keep my options quite wide open for the future. And of course, at the time, I had no idea that I'd end up, here, and it's very exciting to reflect back on this. After I graduated, I wasn't exactly sure where I was going, so I took a job. I was thinking more temporary job as in technical support field, and it was during this time I started interviewing World War II Air Corps veterans. My interest in World War II military aviation comes through the fact that I have European parents that were raised during the war, and I grew up hearing about stories of occupied Holland and the American flyers overhead. My father later immigrated to the States, where he had served a career in the United States Air Force. So airplanes and military have been they're part of who I am, and the extension of interviewing veterans I don't think was too difficult for me, too large of a leap. I later picked up a part-time job doing this same thing, interviewing veterans at the University of Utah. After many, many hours of conducting interviews, I began thinking more and more about what happens to these interviews. And it was from there, in that line of thinking, that I was reintroduced to the purpose of archives. The BYU Special Collections created a part-time internship for me that I was able to extend throughout a year. And there I learned archival processing and the concepts of archival storage. And while there, it was suggested to me that I look deeper and pursue further studies in the archival sciences. This is what I did, and of course that leads me to UT. And University of Texas, at the time, well, and I probably still is, in archival sciences for sure, was the obvious choice, mainly built on the accomplishments of and achievements of Dr. David Gracie, and I would also say Dr. Pat Galloway. Anyone who knows these people will know what I mean, especially the force that is Dr. Gracie. He's so fun to think about. I mean, I wish I should be, if he was here, I would have to be speaking with the inverted triangle in my hand, and throw in the hot dog. Anyway, but it was fantastic. So in 2004, my wife and I found ourselves in easygoing Austin, Texas. I recall that sometime in the first week at the School of Information, there were presentations for the various specializations available to us within the school, and that is where I attended the Preservation and Conservation Studies presentation provided by Ellen Cunningham-Krupa, Karen Pavelka, and Chayla Metzger. Listening to them caused the proverbial light to go off in my head. Yes, I was interested in the intellectual control and access to records materials, but apparently it was the actual physical care of these collections that interested me more. So I signed up as soon as I could. Now, the Preservation Administration specialization in the iSchool itself, I think, ended up being everything I hoped for and much more. Great staff, great classes, great classmates in a great, great town. New York. So let me just quickly touch on something that Jim has already talked about. Some of the coursework, he listed some of the class official titles. The coursework that they provided us was very relevant. We were taught best practices, and I felt I was very well taught. And it wasn't until I entered the workforce that I could actually see how well prepared the program made me. Through the classes, I learned how to create and conduct needs assessments and surveys. I learned about proper care and handling techniques. Learned about archivally sound housing and materials. On the larger facilities aspect, I learned about building structures, environmental monitoring, HVAC systems, lighting, pest management. I need to mention disaster preparedness, disaster recovery, the whole gamut. Of course, digital reformatting. There was a component of lab safety, which I think is also should be mentioned, and practicing judicious use and careful use of supplies and resources. I'm going to have to say, though, that my favorite classes were the book lab classes. It was a thrill to learn about book structure, and for me, sewing a text block is kind of a Zen thing, and I really enjoyed that. Now, all of this coursework was done within the great University of Texas system, which has many libraries and wonderful heritage collections as well, and because of this, I had the opportunity to work with actual collections, and this was proved an invaluable experience as well. The Preservation Administration track required that I complete a practicum, Ellen and the program staff had fostered relationships with many institutions that gladly accepted UT graduates. I was lucky to be able to complete 2 of these practicum. My first one was at Emory University, where I worked in the Klein Library with Lars Meyer and the preservation office there. At the time, that included Anne Friesland and Kate Murray. While there, I conducted AV and book and paper needs assessments and surveys, and also helped in the area of environmental monitoring. My second practicum was with the Harris County District Clerk's Office in Houston, Texas, and there I worked with historic court records, and again performed collection surveys, but there I also made care and rehousing recommendations, and I also created a disaster preparedness plan for them, and that was a really good experience. Now, most all of the coursework and my practicum experiences, I can say, have become directly applicable to my work here at the library. Upon graduating from the program in 2006, I quickly picked up a short-term project job there in Austin, Texas, establishing a business archives for the Lyndon B. Johnson family businesses. And there I was able to put many of my archival class skills and knowledge that I had picked up from UT into practice. While that, I was applying for full-time jobs. And to my surprise, I ended up receiving 2 job offers half an hour apart from each other on the same morning. Now, of course, I chose the Library of Congress. I mean, who wouldn't want to work here? I mean, when I think about it, just look around the room. I mean, these are things you wouldn't expect maybe to see in a library, but we have Stradivarius right over there, many of them. I have a full quartet, I think an original quartet, and kind of shuffled away, you actually have 2 Rodin sculptures that are quite significant, though you may not. They're cast during his lifetime. Anyway, it's amazing here. So I was hired here as, like Jim, as a preservation specialist in the library's conservation division. As a specialist, my colleagues and I work with various divisions to assess and stabilize very large collections. Many of these collections are sent to the library's new off-site high-density storage facility out at Fort Meade, Maryland. I've been in the library in the system for over 5 years now, and during that time, especially during the beginning years, there have been countless occasions to rely back on the instruction I received from the UT program. Needs assessments and surveys are a standard part of our workflow. Understanding proper handling and coming up with housing options are a common task. I also play a large role in monitoring the environmental conditions in all of the library's buildings. And the software program I often use, I was first introduced to it in the UT program. This small presentation and the opportunity for me to reflect upon my time at UT, I think, is quite timely. Currently, I am serving on in extended detail as acting head of the collections care section, and that's that's the section that performs in-house repairs on the library's general book collection. Other than repairing the children's books of my 2 young sons that my 2 young sons have overly loved, as a specialist, I haven't had too much time for bench work and actual book repair. So to help me get back into the proper mindset and to review the various treatments and options that are available to us, I found myself reading once again my personal book repair manual that I had to compile for Chayla's book Lab 1 and 2 course. The manual / notebook has provided to be of great value, and here, almost 6 years later, I find it to be, I'm actually using it in my current work right now. To close, I just want to say that my time within the UT program was absolutely wonderful, and as a whole, the experience has been invaluable to me and my work here at the library. It was a privilege for me to work with so many great classmates, many of which have also gone on to work at many wonderful institutions, and obviously it was a great privilege for me to have been taught by so many true champions in the cause of preserving the cultural record. So I'd like to thank Ellen once again, and Karen, Chayla, and of course Dr. Gracie and Dr. Galloway, and I'm sure there's many others in there. Obviously, without you all, I wouldn't be here at this fine institution. And just to close, can I just finish by saying that I just want to give one example of why I think it's so fun to work here. Just last week, I had in front of me the 1941 original Captain America comic book. Okay? And no more than 5 feet away from me there was a Rachmaninoff collection being assessed. And I think about this, and it's like, how many places are there? Can this happen on a constant basis? And just working here is fabulous. And anyway, thank you, UT, and thank you, the library.
Thank you so much, Ben and Jim and Claire and Ellen and Karen, and of course our new leader, starting in January, Roberta Schaefer. I think we feel so privileged to have the staff that we have here at the library. I cannot thank our extraordinary, excellent conservation and other preservation staff enough. You've just seen just the tip of the iceberg of the expertise and enthusiasm and passion of our staff. And we're so grateful to the training programs for making that possible. As we said, people come from many directions. In some ways, the training programs are actually the easiest way to get here, and it's the most efficient. And it's the way we know kind of what we're getting. And so that's why they are so important, and we hope they continue on. We have a little time for questions. Does anyone, and we'll take questions from the audience, as well as we can take questions from any remote questions we might have. I don't know if we've gotten any remote questions yet, but while we wait to find out, are there any questions from the audience? Does anybody have any, or any experiences? Yeah, oh, or any experiences, yeah, any experiences that anybody might like to share. We have, among our staff at the library, we also have people trained in programs abroad in Europe. And so there are different perspectives with that, but any questions or observations or experiences or final words? I think we have about 7 people in conservation who went through the Columbia and the UT Austin program, and that's a large percentage of our staff, and they've really brought diverse experience. And with regard to Karen's comments about the future and the digital realm, as opposed to analog, working with electronic materials, I think you've seen a little bit with the talk with Jim and Ben both said in terms of working with audiovisual collections. Some of the inroads that we've made, the library does have a very strong research program for audiovisual materials, and we, like many other people, are trying to grapple with the digital realm. But it's our legacy collections. Yes, a question here. Absolutely. And I think you should all be out there lobbying. Yes, thank you. You are so right. We are extremely grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And we still continue to have very good working relationships with them. They've been very supportive of the training programs. Of course, the Library of Congress can't receive any support from them, but they have been extremely supportive in the efforts of preserving cultural heritage. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other comments or questions? Anything from our remote viewers? No? Well, with that, it concludes our program. And again, I thank you very, very much for coming and joining us. And I hope you'll come for the program we have about Buffalo and about the University of Delaware at Winterthur. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.